What if the Lucifer you fear was once called a saint? This question tears through the silence of history, opening a wound few dare to touch. In the forgotten archives of the church lies a name that was meant to inspire light, yet ended up cursed as darkness. Lucifer of Cagliari, a 4th century bishop once proclaimed a defender of the faith, later turned into a symbol of everything condemned. But who was this man? And why did his name vanish from the altars, surviving only as the echo of a demon? The 4th century was a time of invisible wars, fought not only on the borders of the Roman Empire, but within the very heart of the church. Battles over truth, accusations of heresy, persecutions, and councils didn't just decide doctrines, they decided eternal destinies. It was in this chaos that Lucifer of Cagliari, a Sardinian bishop, rose to prominence, carrying a name that would later become a curse: Lucifer, the bearer of light. Back then, the word Lucifer wasn't evil. In Latin, it simply meant morning star, a reference to Venus, the celestial body that announces the dawn. In some ancient Bible translations, even Christ himself was called Lucifer, the one who illuminates mankind with truth. So, how did a sacred name become the ultimate symbol of rebellion and darkness? Lucifer of Cagliari was a warrior of faith. He fiercely defended orthodoxy against Arianism, one of the most dangerous heresies of his time. He confronted emperors, endured exile, and wrote fiery letters that survive to this day as proof of his courage. But his unshakable conviction made him a target. The very strength of his beliefs was twisted and used against him. And that's where the silence begins. Why did the church choose to let his legacy fade away? Why isn't his memory celebrated like that of other saints? Was it simply because of his name? Or was there something deeper, something far more unsettling? The truth is, his title, Saint Lucifer, became a burden too heavy to bear. At that time, his name sounded strange, ambiguous, even dangerous. Centuries later, when interpretations of Isaiah 14 and Revelation became linked to the story of the angel's rebellion, Lucifer shifted from meaning bearer of light to signifying the Lord of darkness. And the Bishop of Cagliari was symbolically dragged into that same abyss. But ask yourself, if Lucifer was once a saint who decided he would forever be known as the enemy, how many other stories have been twisted to keep fear alive? And what if the greatest weapon of faith has always been rewriting history itself? Today, the modern church rarely speaks his name. His feast day still exists in a few local traditions, but quietly, almost in secret. His name is avoided, his legacy buried, and yet the question lingers. Why erase a man who fought so fiercely to defend the purity of faith? Perhaps because the memory of Saint Lucifer is far too dangerous to be remembered. Maybe because it forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. The name we fear the most was once revered as holy, and that's only the first crack in the wall of history. If a bishop of the church, loyal to Christ, could bear the name Lucifer, what else has been buried, silenced, or distorted? The next step is to dive into the maze of language and uncover how Lucifer, the morning star, was condemned for eternity as the prince of hell. But be warned, the answer doesn't set you free. It unsettles you. What could have happened for a name of light to become a synonym for eternal damnation? What do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments. What if the greatest trick in history wasn't the devil, but the change of a single word? In the first part, we saw that a 4th century bishop carried the title of Saint Lucifer, a devout man, a defender of the faith, erased from memory because his very name became cursed. But how exactly did Lucifer, once synonymous with light, become the very definition of evil? The answer begins with a game of translations. In the original Hebrew of Isaiah 14, the phrase is Helel ben Shachar, morning star, son of the dawn. It was a taunt directed at the king of Babylon, a tyrant who believed himself invincible but would fall like any mortal. When this text was translated into Greek, the term became phosphoros, and later, in Latin within the Vulgate, it appeared as Lucifer, the shining star that heralds the dawn. But here's the question. Where is the demon in this passage? Where is the fall of angels? It wasn't there. It was purely political metaphor, not a story of heavenly rebellion. However, over time, theologians began blending different passages. Isaiah 14, Revelation 12 with its battle in heaven, and even ancient Jewish legends about fallen angels. The result was explosive. Lucifer stopped being a poetic title and became the personal name of God's greatest enemy. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, subtle, almost like a spell cast over collective memory. For centuries, Lucifer was still used positively in Christian hymns, in ancient prayers, even referring to the resurrected Christ himself as the morning Lucifer. But starting in the Middle Ages, the negative association became permanent. The question then becomes unavoidable. Who benefits when a symbol of light is condemned as darkness? What happens when language itself becomes a weapon of control? The case of Saint Lucifer of Cagliari is living proof of this erasure. A faithful bishop cursed not because of his actions, but because of the fate of his name. The church saw the problem clearly. How could they venerate a saint whose name had become synonymous with the devil? The solution was simple: hide him, erase him, silence him. But the shadow of that silence speaks louder than 1,000 sermons. Because if a single linguistic twist can turn light into darkness, how many other truths might have been buried beneath the stones of interpretation? And here's the most disturbing detail. Even today, in ancient manuscripts, you can still find hymns and prayers where Christ himself is called Lucifer. Yes, the one who shines brighter than the stars. But have you ever heard a priest dare to speak those words out loud? Why was that version buried? Why did a sacred title become a curse? Could it be that the so-called fight against evil was really a fight to monopolize the light? The story of Saint Lucifer is an uncomfortable reminder. The evil we fear today was born from a translation error, a carefully crafted narrative that shaped centuries of belief, an error that became dogma, a dogma that fueled centuries of fear. But truth is, like a lighthouse, the more you try to cover it, the brighter it shines in the dark. If Christ himself was once called Lucifer, what remains of the line between God and the devil? If this struck you, like this video, and hit the hype button to help spread the word, what if the greatest heresy wasn't challenging the church, but remembering what it tried to erase? The story of Saint Lucifer of Cagliari is more than that of a forgotten bishop. It's a reflection of the invisible war the church waged against itself. Because in the 4th century, Christianity wasn't a solid institution. It was a battlefield. On one side stood the defenders of Trinitarian orthodoxy. On the other, the Arians, who denied the full divinity of Christ. And caught in the middle was Lucifer, the bishop of light. He was unyielding, unbreakable, and for that reason deeply inconvenient. Emperor Constantius II tried to impose the Arian view. Many bishops bent the knee. Lucifer did not. He wrote fiery letters, challenging even imperial authority. He was persecuted, exiled, silenced. But his words survived. His writings still echo with the rage of a man who refused to negotiate his faith. But what happens when a holy name begins to disrupt the official narrative? What do you do when the memory of a faithful bishop becomes too dangerous? The answer was chillingly simple: strategic erasure. When the word Lucifer became associated with the fallen angel, the church faced an impossible choice. Admit that a legitimate saint bore the same name as the devil, or bury him beneath the weight of oblivion. They chose silence. Just a few lines in liturgical calendars, rare mentions in sermons, a small, quiet cult in Cagliari, and nothing more. Saint Lucifer became a ghost, present yet invisible. And here lies the paradox. The very church that once venerated him chose to act as if he had never existed. The bishop who fought against heresies wasn't condemned for mistakes or sins, but for a name whose meaning had been transformed. But was it only about the name? Or was there something far more dangerous in the figure of Lucifer of Cagliari? Some scholars suggest that the bishop's radical stance was deeply unsettling. His refusal to bow to emperors or councils revealed a faith that didn't bend to human power. Perhaps he was an unwanted reminder that the church, time and time again, had bowed not to divine truth, but to political convenience. Erasing Lucifer wasn't just about a name, it was about control. To erase his memory was to silence an example of resistance. And this leads to a much darker question. How many other figures were forgotten? Not because they were wrong, but because their voices challenged the institution's power? Because if even an Orthodox bishop could be buried in darkness, what about the heretics burned at the stake? The apocryphal gospels destroyed, the ancient traditions smothered into silence. The memory of Saint Lucifer tears open a crack in the official narrative. Not everything that was forgotten was false. Many times, it was simply too true to be allowed to survive. And perhaps that's why the church still fears this name. Not just because it's now tied to the devil, but because it reminds us that light itself can be censored. What if the real reason for the silence wasn't just the name, but the danger of the light it represented? Subscribe. What comes next is even darker. What if hell wasn't born from faith, but from politics? By the dawn of the Middle Ages, the name Lucifer no longer meant morning star. It had been transformed into the very essence of evil. But this shift wasn't merely a theological interpretation. It was a strategy. The medieval church understood that fear is more powerful than any sword. Kings can be overthrown, armies can be defeated, but the terror of eternal damnation is indestructible. And so, Lucifer, a name that was once holy, became the personification of fear itself. But why turn light into darkness? Who benefits when a word becomes a curse? The answer lies in control. By linking the name Lucifer to the devil, the church drew a sharp boundary. On one side, salvation, mediated exclusively by the church. On the other, eternal damnation. Any believer who dared to question, think differently, or interpret Scripture in another way was immediately accused of serving Lucifer. And here's the most chilling detail. It was during this very period that the memory of Saint Lucifer of Cagliari almost completely vanished. His feast day was reduced to obscure local celebrations. His biography was diluted into silence. The bishop who once fought against heresies was now seen as a threat to a narrative that required an absolute enemy to maintain its power. Here's the translation with some small adjustments for flow and impact. How could they admit there was once a Saint Lucifer when that very same name was used to terrify entire crowds? How could they keep people faithful through fear if the light of the past was ever revealed? The Middle Ages built its spirituality on this very terror. Sermons spoke of eternal fire. Frescoes showed demons dragging souls into darkness. The name Lucifer was shouted like a sentence, a warning, a final condemnation. And each time it was spoken, the memory of the Bishop of Cagliari faded further into the shadows. But was this really just coincidence? Or was it a deliberate act, a symbolic exile? Because if people discovered that Lucifer was once venerated as a saint, fear itself would lose much of its power. And here lies the most disturbing detail. It was precisely during this period that the memory of Saint Lucifer of Cagliari nearly vanished. His feast day was reduced to obscure local celebrations. His biography dissolved into silence. The bishop who once fought against heresies had become a threat to the narrative that now required an absolute enemy. What if hell isn't a revelation, but an invention? What if Lucifer, as the Prince of Darkness, is the greatest political construction in history? Think about it. A people ruled by fear of death are difficult to control, but a people ruled by fear of what comes after death, they will obey forever. Many of the symbols we now associate with the devil, horns, fire, eternal torment, weren't in the original scriptures. They were crafted through sermons, religious plays, and terrifying works of art. A collective imagination, carefully engineered over centuries. Saint Lucifer, the bishop who defied emperors, could have been remembered as a symbol of resistance, courage, and faithfulness. Instead, he was buried in silence, so that the very name he carried could be turned into invisible chains. And maybe that is the key. The church didn't erase Lucifer merely because of his name, but because his legacy threatened the very system of control that the name eventually came to represent. What if hell is less about fire and more about power? Share this with someone who needs to see what was hidden. What if the name you fear was once used to praise Christ himself? Few people know this. but hidden deep within the oldest archives of the Church. Among forgotten hymns and ancient manuscripts lies a revelation that challenges everything we've been taught. The name Lucifer, now synonymous with terror, was once sung in Christian celebrations as a title for Christ. Yes, you read that right. Christ, the risen Savior, once called Lucifer of the morning. How is that possible? How could a name now linked to darkness once represent divine light? The answer lies in ancient liturgy. In certain versions of the Exsultet, the Easter Vigil hymn, Christ is invoked as Lucifer, not in a demonic sense, but as the bright morning star that never sets, symbolizing victory of light over darkness. But over the centuries, these words were adjusted, softened, hidden. Why? Because the weight of the name had changed. What was once a title of glory became a weapon of fear. The manuscripts, however, don't lie. They still exist, preserved in Latin, silent witnesses to a past the Church rarely dares to mention. The morning star, Lucifer, directly identified with the living Christ. So when did the line between God and the devil stop being clear? Or was there never a clear line at all? Only competing narratives fighting for control of the light? For centuries, the Church lived with three coexisting meanings. The faithful bishop, Saint Lucifer of Cagliari, the morning Christ praised in hymns, the fallen angel, enemy of souls, three layers of one name, until only the darkest survived. And the questions grow darker. Who decided Lucifer should only be remembered as the enemy? Who erased the light and preserved only the shadows? Perhaps because a Christ called Lucifer would confuse too many. Perhaps because a saint named Lucifer would weaken the grip of fear. Or perhaps because multiplying the light would threaten the power of those claiming to hold the keys to heaven and hell. From the Middle Ages onward, this past was locked away. Few have seen the manuscripts. Fewer still know that once upon a time the faithful sang with devotion. Christus est Lucifer, Christ is Lucifer. This revelation opens a deep chasm. If even Christ was once called Lucifer, then transforming this name into the ultimate symbol of evil wasn't a mistranslation. It was a deliberate choice. But what does that choice reveal? Could the battle between light and darkness be less spiritual than we imagine, and more political than we dare admit? The documents remain hidden, studied by scholars, silenced in churches, a secret that refuses to die. If Christ was once called Lucifer, who truly decides what is sacred and what is profane? Have you ever wondered about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Perfect. What if a single word was enough to condemn someone to eternal fire? By the Middle Ages, the name Lucifer was no longer remembered as the morning star, nor as a title for Christ, nor as the name of a steadfast bishop of faith. It had become a seal of damnation, a label, a weapon. No evidence was needed, no witnesses required. All it took was accusing someone of serving Lucifer, and suddenly, lives were burned in public squares. This is how fear became law. Philosophers, mystics, women who dared to study herbs, men who questioned dogma, peasants who read the Bible on their own. All could be branded with the same name, servants of Lucifer. The name stopped being just a word. It became a sentence. But think about it. If Lucifer was once Christ, once a saint, what kind of power did the Church wield to turn that memory into a curse? It was the power of narrative. The case of Saint Lucifer of Cagliari, now nearly forgotten, was a dangerous ghost from the past. How could they explain to the people that there was once a saint named Lucifer while using that same name to justify executions? It was safer to erase him, to bury his memory and feed only the fear. This process ran deeper than we imagine. It wasn't just about demonizing a name. It was about controlling imagination itself. When someone was accused of following Lucifer, there was no possible defense. The game was already lost. The accusation didn't need proof. The very word carried the weight of condemnation. What if the true hell wasn't the fire, but the silence forced by an accusation? What if the greatest sin was simply doubting the official narrative? This mechanism empowered courts, inquisitions, and spiritual armies. The fear of the name became stronger than the name of God, because it wasn't love that kept the faithful obedient. It was the terror of being mistaken for the enemy. And in this world ruled by fear, Saint Lucifer became unbearable. His name stood as proof that history could have been different. He was evidence that light and darkness weren't absolute truths, but malleable forces shaped and manipulated by those in power. Why remember an inconvenient saint when his name was far more useful as a tool to terrify the masses? The demonization of Lucifer was more than theological. It was political, social, and psychological, the perfect mechanism, an invisible enemy, always present, always lurking, ready to justify endless persecution. For centuries, the Church built its authority not only on the promise of heaven, but on the threat of hell. And Lucifer, once a bearer of light, became the very mask of fear. But the story doesn't end there. Some manuscripts and secret traditions preserved unsettling echoes, whispers that suggest the light was never fully extinguished. And what if, beneath all the fear, the true face of the light-bearer still remains? Like this, if any part of it made you feel uncomfortable. Excellent. What if what they called darkness was really just the light someone wanted to hide? For centuries, the word Lucifer was synonymous with terror. But quietly, on the fringes of history, there were those who dared to question the narrative. Men and women who noticed something dangerous. If the Church had to demonize this name so completely, perhaps there was a hidden power within it. And so, whispers began to spread through secret societies. Alchemists, Kabbalists, and so-called heretics. Lucifer was not the enemy of light. He was the forbidden light itself. In medieval grimoires, hermetic symbols, and hidden manuscripts, the name Lucifer appeared as a key to knowledge, not as a lord of darkness, but as the bearer of the flame that frees humanity from ignorance. The Inquisitors knew this. That's why they hunted so fiercely any sect that dared to speak his name in a different way. Because the truth was simple, nothing is more dangerous to an empire of fear than turning its greatest enemy into an ally. Think about it. If Lucifer literally means bearer of light, who decided that this light was cursed? Hermetic orders, inspired by Gnostic traditions and Neoplatonism, began reclaiming this vision. To them, the fall of Lucifer wasn't a defeat, but an act of rebellion, a declaration of independence against a God who demanded blind obedience. The narrative flipped. The demon of the Church became, for the occultists, the archetype of freedom. And this shift wasn't just symbolic, it ignited ideas. During the Renaissance, alchemists saw Lucifer as the patron of hidden knowledge buried in the stars. In the Enlightenment, thinkers reinterpreted his figure as a metaphor for reason defying tyranny. In the rituals of secret societies, his name was invoked, not to summon evil, but to claim spiritual autonomy. What the Church condemned as blasphemy, occultism embraced as the key to liberation. But there was danger. Every time someone tried to restore Lucifer's image as a symbol of light, persecution, censorship, and flames followed. It was an invisible war between two narratives, one of fear and one of freedom. What was at stake wasn't just faith. It was control over the very concept of truth. Slowly, the forbidden flame began to spread. Writers, poets, and philosophers dared to reclaim the cursed name. Even in art, Lucifer appeared as a complex figure, not merely the demon of damnation, but a tragic rebel, carrying the burden of questioning the established order. Perhaps that's why even today the name is so divisive, because Lucifer holds within it not only the mark of condemnation, but also the echo of rebellion that refuses to be extinguished. What if the real secret isn't who Lucifer is, but why some have fought so hard to make sure you never find out? If this opened your mind, leave a comment, light or darkness. What if what they called evil was really just the most human face of the pursuit of freedom? In modern times, something curious happened. The figure of Lucifer slipped out of the Church's control. A name that was once only a curse began to reappear in books, music, poetry, and even political movements. To the Romantics, Lucifer became the archetype of the tragic hero, the one who dares to stand against absolute power, even knowing he will be defeated. To philosophers, he represented reason itself, bold enough to challenge dogmas. To artists, He was the metaphor of creation pushing against boundaries. Literature gave this vision a voice. Writers like John Milton and later 19th century poets turned Lucifer into a complex character, not just God's enemy, but the rebellious spirit carrying the spark of autonomy. What was once forbidden now became a source of inspiration. In visual arts, Lucifer appeared not as a monster, but as a beautiful, tragic, melancholic figure in paintings and sculptures. This image, so different from the King of Darkness, revealed something profound. Perhaps he didn't represent absolute evil, but rather the human struggle with power and obedience. Then came the modern occult movements. Orders like the Golden Dawn, branches of Freemasonry, and other esoteric groups reinterpreted Lucifer as a symbol of inner knowledge and spiritual awakening. It was no longer just about opposing the church. It became an alternative spiritual path. The 20th century pushed this even further. Pop culture embraced the myth. Comics, movies, and songs turned Lucifer into a modern legend, sometimes a villain, sometimes an anti-hero, sometimes a liberator. And every version carried the same haunting question: who decides what is light and what is darkness? Meanwhile, openly declared religious movements began to emerge. Satanic churches and Luciferian groups started claiming the name that had been taboo for centuries. But here the meaning shifted again. Many of these groups didn't see Lucifer as a demonic being, but as an archetype of freedom, a symbol of rebellion against oppression and the refusal to blindly accept ready-made truths. Ask yourself this: if a name has survived centuries of persecution, burnings, and censorship, what keeps it alive even now? Perhaps it's because Lucifer was never just about religion. He is about power, about who gets to define good and evil, about who controls the narrative and who dares to break it. And so, the morning star began to shine again, not on official altars, but in books, in songs, in symbols tattooed on the skin of young people rejecting conformity. He became a cultural icon, representing something greater than dogma, the eternal temptation of freedom. And what if this return isn't just cultural, but a sign of something spiritual still to come? If you believe this story isn't over yet, share this video. What if Lucifer isn't just a myth from the past, but a silent force shaping the present? The 21st century has brought something even the most feared inquisitors could never have imagined. The name Lucifer is being spoken, again in temples, secret gatherings, and even official records. What was once just a shadow or a metaphor has now become an identity. Satanic churches, Luciferian societies, and modern cults around the world now openly claim the title of bearers of the light. To them, Lucifer isn't the devil described by tradition, but an archetype of freedom, reason, and forbidden knowledge. In Brazil, the United States, and across Europe, small Luciferian temples quietly rise, hidden, discreet, yet deeply symbolic. They don't ask for forgiveness. They don't hide behind half-truths. They embrace Lucifer's flame as a banner against what they call the oppression of traditional religions. But that's only the surface. Documents and testimonies point to tighter, more exclusive circles. Secret orders that never appear in the media, yet silently influence culture, politics, and even economic decisions. Within these orders, Lucifer's name is spoken during rituals as an invocation of the true light, the one meant to free people from the control of dogmas and governments. Ask yourself this: if the name the church tried to erase is now reborn on modern altars, who is truly winning the battle of memory? At the same time, intellectuals and philosophers are reclaiming the term on a symbolic level. Universities now discuss Lucifer, not only as a biblical figure, but also as a historical metaphor for resistance against any form of centralized power. The morning star, forgotten for centuries, is now studied, reinterpreted, and debated. On social media, young people are adopting the name as an aesthetic identity. Profiles, music, digital art, all evoking a Lucifer that is not a monster, but an archetype of authenticity. This cultural phenomenon merges with spirituality, blurring the line between metaphor and worship. Meanwhile, the official church remains silent. No declarations, no public condemnations, just silence. The same silence history always keeps when it can't erase something, yet fears legitimizing it by speaking of it. But the most unsettling question isn't that Lucifer has returned, it's how he has returned, not as a hidden enemy, but as a declared ally of those seeking a new form of spirituality, politics and society. And what if all of this, from art to cults, from academia to secret rituals, is just the prelude to an even greater revelation, one the church could never allow to surface? If this disturbed you, that was the point. Leave a comment. What if the forgotten saint and the feared devil were always the same? Shadow cast in opposite directions? The name that means bearer of light was once used for Christ, for a faithful bishop, for the morning star, but it was also given to the fallen angel, the adversary, the embodiment of pure evil. What seems like confusion might actually be strategy. By erasing Saint Lucifer from memory, the church left only one version of the name to survive as a synonym for evil. A name that once symbolized faith was turned into a taboo. A word meant to inspire became a threat. Think about it. If the name of a faithful bishop could be cursed, what else might have been twisted over time? How many saints were turned into heretics? How many so-called enemies were really defenders of a truth, too dangerous to be accepted? And what if the very idea of Lucifer as the devil was the greatest manipulation ever carried out? A way to silence any search for light that didn't come from the official altar. Ask yourself, why was a title once used for Christ, the morning star, allowed to fall into darkness forever? Why was there no effort to reclaim it? The answer is uncomfortable, because silence was useful. Because fear is far more powerful than remembrance. Saint Lucifer, the forgotten bishop, fought fiercely against internal heresies. He was strict, radical, and deeply unsettling. His voice was silenced, but his name survived, twisted, corrupted, and ultimately used against him. And so, what we call the devil may not only be a rebellious entity, but also the distorted reflection of all who dared to challenge dominant narratives. Perhaps the real hell isn't a fiery pit, but the forced forgetting imposed by history itself. Today, when we hear the word Lucifer, we immediately think of absolute evil. But behind the curtains of history, that same name once belonged to a saint. The morning star never stopped shining. We just see it now from a different, carefully manipulated angle. And so the final question echoes. What if Lucifer was never the enemy, but the missing key to understanding what the church has always feared to reveal? If this is the truth, why are we still keeping our eyes shut? And if it's real, write your truth below.